So last week I actually posted a A7R5 rumors discussion video. The rumor was expected to be announced on the 26th of February, which unfortunately did not happen. The rumored specs are still up for discussion, so if you're still interested in what the potential specs are going to be, please do check out the video, but just know that the announcement has now been pushed to later on in the year. But for this week, I was actually fully prepared to put down my pre-order for the A7 IV. But then this actually triggered the thought that would I actually buy the A7 IV in 2025 if I didn't already have it? So this actually may hurt my retention on the video, but the answer to the question is yes, I would. The camera's got me through many professional jobs over the past couple of years, and I still have every intention of using it moving forward until the A7 IV comes out. But if you saw my A7 IV video, you know I don't consider it a perfect camera, and there's definitely some things I want to improve for the A7 IV, but the camera is otherwise perfectly serviceable for most professional needs. The only caveat I have when it comes to saying that I would purchase the A7 IV is just that I wouldn't buy it full retail price. When the A7 V comes out, it's rumored to be about £2,600, and currently on the used market at the moment, the A7 IV is ranging between £1,400 to £1,600 depending on its condition and where you buy it. So the A7 IV is actually in a unique spot at the moment because it's a highly regarded camera for over the past couple of years. It's actually reached a low price point to the point where it's accessible to entry-level enthusiasts, but it's also perfectly fine and it's perfectly capable to service professionals. So some professionals may actually opt to get two A7 IVs over an A7 V, and on the other side of the scale is that you may have some very enthusiastic hobbyists or professionals or entry-level professionals who just actually want to dabble in full-frame Sony E-mount system. There's been very few instances where I've actually used the A7 IV and I felt like I couldn't get what I needed, but otherwise I've been perfectly happy with the camera. So as before, I'm going to start at the conclusion. The conclusion is yes, it is worth it in 2025. Just depending on how much you can get it for. The rest of the decision factors are all personal choice. So I'll be interested in down in the comments below if you did actually purchase it, or you are going to purchase it, or if you have one yourself and what you think. But now that's out the way, I'm going to get into the specifics of the points that I wanted to discuss about the A7 IV. Now for full context, for people who don't actually know my work, I'm a professional photographer who's actually been doing photography for 14 years. I've then pivoted to videography over the past couple of years just because of that's how the market is moving at the moment, and you do need to have video skills. I shoot predominantly events, but I have found myself in the studio shooting some headshots as well as some editorial type of looks. I've also done a few live event streams as well as some talking head interviews and just general event coverage for videography. And why I felt I needed to kind of get that out of the way is just to contextualize my view on everything that I'm going to be discussing. And the first one's going to be overheating. Unfortunately, the A7 IV does suffer from overheating. And I say the word suffer, but it's not really suffering because it's actually a hybrid camera, which is actually not predominantly a video camera anyway. It's just more like a photography camera that can do video. But one of the first shoots I found myself on with the A7 IV, I was actually shooting a discussion panel with an audience. At that point, I actually had 3 A7 IVs, and that was before I actually sold 2 of my A7 IVs for my A1. And again, just to contextualize the situation, I had 3 A7 IVs shooting this discussion panel, 2 of which were kind of just facing left and right. And the third camera I was actually hand holding, actually shooting some B-roll of the audience, just a general event vibe, and using it for some static wide shots as well. And what I found in that event is that the one camera that overheated on me was the one that I was holding in my hands. The other 2 cameras were just statically recording, whereas the one that I was holding in my hands was actually kind of moving in between photography and videography, shooting some odd clips, and at times I was putting on a tripod for just the wide shot at the front, but that is the camera that overheated. My assumption at that point was that it was actually the camera that was working the hardest in the sense that it's moving around having to stabilize the footage a lot more. I'm actually, because my hands are holding it, it's actually not like dissipating the heat as much maybe. And it also was the one shooting at 50p because the other 2 were actually just static at 25p. So that may have been a factor. But nonetheless, that discussion panel lasted for about an hour and the other 2 cameras didn't overheat. So my point in raising that story was just that the overheating, it just varies depending on your use. But if you really are concerned about the camera overheating, I've actually done a video on the Ulanzi cooling fan, which I actually feel solves that problem. But obviously you do now have to factor in that you have to have another battery powered device attached to the back of your camera. So it's definitely not a camera that I would rely on as an A cam for any important video shoots. But it would be awesome for a B camera or even just like these talking head videos where you could actually just re-record. But for an event where it's a one-time only thing, it's not something that I personally would feel comfortable using. But again, I have some overheating tests in that Ulanzi cooling fan video where I actually compare the A7C II as well as the A7 IV, which they both perform quite similarly. So go check out that video for the results. And now for the image quality. As you probably know by now, it's actually a 33 megapixel sensor. So for the video side of things, it's actually recording on the full sensor and it's downscaling it down to 4K. So you actually supposedly get a really sharp image. I've always been confused by this because I didn't understand why they don't actually just record the full frame as it is and allow us to downscale in post. I'm no engineer, so I don't actually know what the specifics are, but I would imagine it would actually take much more processing power to read 7K and then downscale it to 4K. And why not just throughput all of that data as 7K? Or at the very least, give us the option to. But nonetheless, the video quality coming out of it is perfectly fine for most circumstances. For talking head videos like this or any interviews, it's going to do the job perfectly fine. but anything for fast action moving, you may start seeing some rolling shutter. It's a pretty standard sensor readout speed, so the rolling shutter performance isn't going to be really bad. But unfortunately, it just depends on where you are in your career and what cameras you're used to, and how much of an eye you have for rolling shutter will depend on whether you feel this is going to be usable for you or not. But in terms of the colors, the dynamic range, and the general sharpness of the video that's coming out of this camera, as far as I can tell, it's perfectly fine for me. But for photography, that's a whole different conversation. At 33 megapixels is actually like the perfect amount for event coverage, because if in a pinch I need to crop in later in post, I can do, but also the file sizes aren't unmanageable. I found myself at times flicking into APS-C mode just to get a bit more reach. I've actually got a shortcut button on my camera where if I hit it, I flip into APS-C mode, and this allows me to quickly zoom in at 1.5 times in a pinch. So as an example, if I'm shooting on 24-70, but I've maxed out at 70mm and I need to get that little bit more range, if I hit that button, I've now got an equivalent to a 105mm, and I have sacrificed some megapixels. But when it comes to event shooting, I'm still perfectly fine with 18 megapixels. And I would rather catch the moment, even if it's not in the most optimal situation, but just capturing the moment is more important to me. In terms of noise performance itself, my limit is around 16 to 3200. That's not necessarily saying it's bad performing at that range or above. It's just my personal preference that I'd rather not take it beyond that. So if I'm shooting on a 24-70 and then I reach that 1600 to 3200 ISO performance limit, I would actually then prefer to switch over to a prime lens rather than carrying on ramping up. But sometimes you are just shooting in really dark, impossible environments and you do need to ramp up to 64 12,800. So at that point, it is what it is at that stage. But again, just to be very clear, that's just a personal preference thing, and that's not me saying that it's unusable at ISO 1600. In terms of the autofocus performance, I've actually had no real complaints with the camera. There are times, of course, where I'm shooting an event and I just feel like, oh, I wish it was a little bit faster, but that's with everything in life. You're always going to want something slightly better or slightly faster, slightly more accurate. And over time, we will get these improvements. It's just for the simple fact that for the A7 IV, I haven't found that I haven't been able to get through any jobs. I have the A7C II and I haven't necessarily shot it in the same exact professional environments. But just anecdotally, as I'm using the camera, I'm not feeling like the A7C II is outperforming the A7 IV in all terms of autofocus so wildly. And it's more of a testament to the performance of the A7 IV's autofocus system. Slightly separately to that, I actually have the Sony A1, which has the same generation autofocus as the A7 IV. And just before an event last year, my A1 actually died on me. So then I quickly had to go out and rent a Sony A7 IV, which is the newest flagship at the time, which does have the AI autofocusing system. And I got through the event perfectly fine, and the photos were delivered to the client and everyone was happy. A year later, because this is an annual event for this client, and at the same venue, at a more or less same event type of structure, same layout, same lighting, same everything, I didn't find myself thinking, oh, the A7 IV was just so much better. If anything, I preferred the Sony A1 just because of the fact I got more megapixels to work with and I preferred the image quality coming out of it. But I have no real strong memories that the autofocus was actually better last year than it was this year. So to my point, when it comes to the A7 IV, the autofocus is going to service you perfectly fine. And unless you're going to be doing side-by-side comparisons, I don't think you're going to notice the difference between the A7 IV and the A7 V's autofocus. For the most part, I use it in touch tracking mode where I just tap the back of the LCD screen to lock onto what I want to lock on, and it holds fine. Yes, you do have situations where if someone's to walk in front of the camera, it might take that tracking spot and move it away. Just quickly tap it again. The AI autofocus may just ignore that person walking through, but my point is it's not unusable and it's not that you can't work with it. Now the 4K 60 crop is something that I discussed in the last A7 IV rumor video. This is a point that may not affect many people at all, because if you're shooting in a controlled situation where you're shooting B-roll for like products or anything like that, it's perfectly fine. The situation where I find myself in very regularly is where I shoot events. It's really annoying that when I'm in photos and I'm actually snapping the shots with my full frame lens on, and then I hit record and then it goes to 4K 50 and it just crops in massively. I mean, to be fair, shooting photos and videos at the same time is not typical for most people. But I even do feel this in my personal life. When I'm with the family and I see my nieces and nephews running around and I want to snap some photos and also capture some video, it can be really annoying that when you're snapping the photos, you framed it up nicely, then you hit record, now your framing changes. So unfortunately, when it comes to that situation, you do have to consider what lenses you're going to be using with this camera. But just in closing, I don't actually have too many complaints with this camera at all. And as I already said at the very beginning of the video, I do highly recommend this camera. If your budget doesn't actually allow you for the flagship models, if you were to pick up the A7 IV, there's very little that you'd be missing out on. The one thing I would just simply say is I wouldn't buy this camera brand new in 2025. It would just be a bit of a waste of money considering the A7 IV is coming out very soon. But if you have to start creating today, pick up the A7 IV used, and there will be very little that you'll be missing out on when it comes to the flagship features. For the stuff that I typically shoot professionally, I don't need to use every single feature the A7 IV has to offer, so I've only flagged and discussed the certain points that really affected me over the past couple of years. But if there's any more specific tests you wanted me to try out, by all means please let me know in the comments below, and I might follow up with it on a YouTube short or something like that. But until then, the camera still does get a very high recommendation from me in 2025.